Hey, want to know a fun fact? This video was finished weeks ago, but as soon as I finished it, the government announced a whole new suite of reforms the day I finished editing it. So that's just my luck. What reforms? The original video was just on the transit-oriented development state environmental planning policy, but on the 21st of February, they announced the new mid and low-rise housing policy. So what are these policies? And what do they do? Well, hopefully that's this video, because if they announce another one before I post this video, I'll cry. To start, the TODD SEPP allows high density development near certain train stations on the metro, suburban and intercity rail networks. The idea is to build more homes close to transport hubs, making it easier for people to live near public transport and reducing reliance on cars. The first part of the program focuses on 8 key stations: Bankstown, Bays West, Bella Vista, Crow's Nest, Homebush, Hornsby, Kellyville and Macquarie Park. These are called accelerated precincts because they're being prioritised for planning and development. The government will create master plans for these areas, working with councils and the community to decide the best way forward. If you wish to view them, I'll leave the link in the description. The second part of the program applies to 31 other stations across New South Wales. For these, the upzoning will only apply within 400 metres of the station and there will be no master planning process. Instead, the new rules will apply automatically. And these are followed by the low and mid-rise housing precincts, which apply within 800 metres of 171 precincts around New South Wales. Uniquely, this specific reform applies to not just train stations, but also to town centres, including some that don't have train stations, but more on that later. So, a SEPP, or State Environmental Planning Policy, is a rule set by the state government that overrides local council planning controls. The TODD SEPP applies to all residential zones, R1, R2, R3 and R4, as well as employment zones E1 and E2. These were previously called business zones and include local high streets and larger commercial centres. The two main types of housing allowed under the TODD SEPP are residential flat buildings and shop top housing. These developments are pretty much what they say on the tin. Residential flats are purely housing, while shop top housing includes homes above ground floor shops. The rules differ slightly between zones. For example, shop top housing is not allowed in residential zones, and residential flats are not permitted in E2 commercial zones. There are also height limits. Shop top housing can be up to 24 metres tall, while residential flat buildings have a maximum height of 22 metres, typically around 6 to 7 stories. Floor space ratios are also set to control how much can be built on a site. The FSR under the TODD SEPP is 2.5 to 1, meaning a 100 square metre site can have a max total floor area of 250 square metres. This also encourages more mid-rise development rather than very tall buildings. These controls are also non-discretionary, so they effectively set minimum standards. For example, if a council's floor space ratio is lower, then the SEPP's controls apply. But if it's higher, then the council's controls apply. To ensure good design, residential buildings in the E1 zone must have active street frontages. This means the ground floor must be engaging with features like shops, cafes, or landscaping to make the street feel welcoming. This helps with safety too, as more people around means fewer opportunities for crime. This approach is part of a planning concept called TODD, or Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design, which focuses on making spaces safer by keeping them busy and well lit. Back to the topic of actual development controls, the low and mid-rise housing policy has similar standards, although they're quite individual to each housing type. And similar to the TODD SEPP, the controls are all non-discretionary. So, dual occupancies are now allowed statewide in the R2 zone, and have an FSR of up to 0.65 to 1. While in the selected precincts, multi-dwelling and terrace houses with an FSR of up to 0.7 to 1 are now allowed in the R2 zone, and residential flat buildings with an FSR of up to 0.8 to 1 are now allowed in the R2 zone, and an FSR of up to 2.2 to 1 in the R3 and R4 zones. Interestingly, it appears that shop top housing will also be allowed in the R1 and R2 zones, just with an FSR of up to 0.8 to 1, but with an FSR of up to 2.2 to 1 within 400 metres of the precinct, and 1.5 to 1 within 400, 800 metres. So to be truthful, it seems that TODD SEPP and low and mid-rise housing reform are pretty solid. However, when it comes to affordable housing, the issues begin to rise. One of the key requirements of the TODD SEPP is that at least 2% of the total floor area in any development must be set aside as affordable housing. This housing will be managed permanently by a community housing provider, but this is lower than the usual 10% affordable housing requirement under existing rules, although it has the benefit of being permanent, unlike the standard requirement which is only for 15 years. In the accelerated precincts, the goal is for at least 3% of all new dwellings to be affordable, with some areas aiming for even higher targets. For example, Bankstown has a minimum requirement of 4%, while Hornsby is aiming for between 4 and 10%. But in contrast, in the low and mid-rise housing areas, there's no affordable housing requirements at all. Frankly, the lack of affordable housing requirements does raise a concern of whether the policy will meaningfully improve housing affordability outside of just increasing supply. Another issue is that some of the stations included in the program have already been rezoned for higher density, making the TODD SEPP redundant. Lidcombe is an example where similar zoning changes have already been made. So, adding it to the list doesn't make sense. Another example is Tuggerah, which is surrounded by industrial and conservation areas where the TODD SEPP doesn't apply, limiting its impact. To be fair, in Tuggerah's case, the low and mid-rise housing reforms do increase the area that's upzoned, and some of this policy choices are also a bit weird. So for each of them, the government has thankfully released the criteria for selecting precincts. For the TODD SEPP, it's being on an electrified heavy rail line, being within 30 minutes of a metropolitan centre, having capacity for additional homes, and having enough capacity on the rail network to handle more passengers, and aligning with government housing priorities, and being in an area with existing residential land. However, some stations seem to have chosen despite not meeting these criteria. For example, the aforementioned Tuggerah with its lack of residential land, but also Banksia, Rockdale and Kogarah, which are on the Illawarra line, and they're already overcrowded during peak hours. Adding more residents there without improving transport services could only make congestion worse. While running extra trains could help, it would require upgrading substations along the line to allow for newer 4th generation trains, or for Tangaros and other lines to be replaced and sent there. Other locations like Burrigal, Katara and Adamstown in Newcastle, and North Wollongong, Corrimal and Dapto in Wollongong only get train services once an hour for most of the day, which just is not good enough for true transport-oriented development. To make the TODD SEPP work in these areas, train service would need to be increased to at least every 30 minutes, ideally every 15. However, this will require major infrastructure upgrades, such as removing level crossings. Adamstown and Dapto both have train lines running directly across roads, and upgrading the crossings would be expensive, especially in the case of Adamstown, as how do you even do it? You can't have the road change grade, so it has to be the railway line, but the railway line can't change grade because of the large rail yard nearby, so it's a catch-22. But in a similar vein, how do we run more trains? We're going to need to keep the express trains between Sydney, Newcastle and Wollongong, so if you want to run more trains to these stations, we need to add more tracks to allow them to overtake, or, in the case of the Illawarra line, duplicate the single track portions of the line, which is expensive. So I don't know how these stations met the criteria for places with additional rail capacity, because rail capacity alone doesn't make transport-oriented development work. You need frequency too. As for the low and mid-rise housing reform, it's fairly similar. For stations, they require 4 train services or more per hour for stations in Sydney, and 2 or more per hour for regional stations, while having a travel time of less than 30 minutes to a major centre, and access to major goods and services. So, basically similar to the TODD SEPP. Major centres are somewhat different. They require a full-service supermarket, buses with less than 15-minute frequency to a major town centre, and that town centre must be less than 30 minutes away. Truthfully, the station selection, at least for me, doesn't seem to have any egregious standouts. Our only comments would be that we need to increase train frequencies and capacities on basically every train line now, but that's a whole different conversation. The choice of town centres can be a bit odd though. For instance, places like Menai seem an odd choice. There are buses from there to Revesby and Sutherland Station, and they're somewhat frequent. But, as someone who's used them in the past, they're slow and unreliable. Unless there are some major upgrades to the buses around these precincts, then most people end up driving instead, which is only going to exacerbate traffic. But, there are some precincts that are just egregious. If you don't know, I grew up in Port Stephens, and both Nelson Bay and Raymond Terrace are on the list. And I'm quite familiar with both. Do they have full-service supermarkets? Yes. For some reason, Raymond Terrace has 2 Woolies across the street from each other, but Raymond Terrace has buses half hourly at best, hourly at worst, to the nearest urban centres, which are Maitland and Newcastle, and the airport, which takes between 30 and 45 minutes, neither of which are below the 30-minute threshold. However, Nelson Bay, it's an hour by bus to the airport and an hour and a half to Newcastle, and those buses are hourly. They're also basically non-existent on weekends and incredibly unreliable. Trust me, I had to rely on them for getting around as a teenager and community work when I graduated. No one is relying on them for work if they have a choice, or value their time. I genuinely have no clue why either of these centres are on the list. If there was a major plan to increase the reliability, speed and frequency of buses in these areas, I'd say go for it. But there isn't, so... But on the topic of speed, there's also the topic of high-speed rail. At the time of making this video, the High Speed Rail Authority has yet to release their business case, but we can make some educated guesses. More than likely, the line will involve a tunnel from Sydney all the way to Gosford, and then an upgraded alignment from there to Newcastle. The existing line past Gosford is relatively straight, flat, and undeveloped. Additionally, in the past, the line was straighter, and that right-of-way still exists. That additional curves in the 1920s to make it easier for freight trains. However, for the TODD SEPP, it causes issues, because if they reuse the older, straighter alignment, or even a new one, then stations like Burrigal will more than likely close or change location. To be fair, we don't know, but this uncertainty makes it difficult to plan for long-term development in affected areas. There has also been some resistance from councils. Burwood Council, for example, opposed the inclusion of Croydon Station due to heritage concerns and conflicts with their strategic plan. However, their plan only suggests allowing medium-density development by 2030, which seems too slow given the urgent need for more housing. The TODD SEPP still allows councils to enforce heritage protections, so concerns around preserving historic buildings should not be an issue. Other councils like Ku-ring-gai have also opposed changes, arguing they want to keep their village character. While community concerns should be considered, there is a limit to how much low-density housing can be maintained in a city facing a housing crisis. If people want to live in low-density areas, that's fine. There are plenty of low-density options outside major transport hubs. There's also been some unprofessionalism from the government. They effectively only announced their low and mid-rise housing reform on the 21st of February, and it went into effect on the 28th. And as of rewriting the script on the 1st of March, and filming on the 2nd, the housing step has still not been updated. It says it's Chapter 6, but there's no Chapter 6. And on the list of precincts, when you click for more information about them, you get full details for entry. It makes the entire program seem rushed, which is just not good enough. But to conclude, I'm a firm believer in the TODD SEPP and the low and mid-rise housing reform. I think it's a great move by the state government, and it allows us to make the most use of the infrastructure we've invested in recently, while also helping to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But, obviously, it has some flaws. The government should have been more selective with the precincts it chose. There was no point applying the SEPP or reform to precincts that have already been upzoned, or to areas with little residential or commercial land nearby. There should have also been more coordination between transport planning and the stations being rezoned. If it is difficult to increase capacity or provide a reliable and frequent service to a precinct, it should not be on the list. Originally, my conclusion said I hope they add more stations to the program, but I'm not going to do that because I don't want to remake this video again when they release a new reform. But yeah, I hope we do more planning explainer videos this year, so if you enjoyed it, subscribe. I graduated from my bachelor's with distinction this year, so I'm hoping to put my degree to good use. If you want to help pay off my HEX debt, you can join my Ko-fi and join the lovely people, including my actual parents, Aaron Slater, Skipper Roo, Melee, Axwalia, Luke Norris, Z, Christopher, Building Beautifully, CK, Jonowy, and Samantha. Their support means everything to me, and if you like this video, feel free to subscribe. But yeah, I'll hopefully be back to you soon with another video. I also uploaded the original video, unlisted, and there's a link in the description if you're curious. If you're wondering why I filmed that one on a rooftop with a view and not this one, it's because I'm filming this the day after the Mardi Gras parade, and literally every person that helps film my video was in it. And they'd kill me if I asked them to come help. So instead, you get me against the wall of my newish apartment.